My guest today crossed paths with me during a chance encounter sitting on a panel for Women's History Month. In one of the most least likely forums, we intersected at an event hosted by the Citadel. And in a twist of fate, I give the Citadel graduates of Washington a hat tip for a well-discussed forum that opened opportunities for graduates to discuss with both female Citadel grads and current service members in the armed forces. Today's topic on meeting an organization's full potential comes from Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Jessica Ruttenber. She's an Air Force pilot currently serving at the Pentagon with experience in cyber, Headquarters Air Force Program Management, and operational leadership roles. She works tirelessly on the Air Force Barriers Analysis Working Group's Women's Initiative team, focusing on changing barriers to employment, accessions, advancement, and retention of women, both civilian and military. Hey, Jess, thanks so much for joining me today on Candid Leadership. It's great having you here.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Now, I have read your phenomenal writing on hidden barriers. I have seen you speak publicly in a multitude of different forums, especially with the United States Air Force Academy and some of the work that you've done in the human dimension there. But today's meeting, we're really going to talk about meeting an organization's full potential. And I think you have a phenomenal story with respect to getting into an organization. Do you want to talk about kind of your story and how you got to where you're at with respect to being a pilot?
Yes. So when I wanted to join the Air Force 20 years ago, I didn't have the medical clearance to become a pilot. I was found to be a half an inch too short. And this was my lifelong dream. So I was very persistent. And I was removed from the first day of pilot training when my medical physical came back showing that I was a little short. And I spent the next few months driving around the country to measure myself in different types of aircraft, like the C-17 in Charleston, C-130 in Little Rock. We had KC-135s at Meridian, Mississippi at the time, and collected all that data to show that I was safe to perform aircrew duties in these aircraft. And I would take all this back, package it up, and apply for an exception of policy to return to pilot training. And I went on from there. I didn't really think about my height again until about 15 years later, when I started getting into advocacy work for women in the Air Force to find out reasons why we had such low numbers for female pilots. For those of you that are not familiar, Air Force pilots, there's only 5% females and only 2% female fighter pilots, which is shockingly low considering women have been allowed to fly in combat since 1993. And one of the things I found was, as I was looking for data to support data-driven decisions, was that what happened to me has happened to hundreds, maybe thousands of women over the last couple of decades, that we have engineered a barrier into our aircraft without even knowing it. And when I say that is that the minimum standing height required to become a pilot, 5'4", eliminates 44% of the U.S. female population from entering a career into aviation. But you also get measured, in your sitting height. So imagine you're sitting in a cockpit in the chair, and you have to be able to look out. So they measure you from your hip up to your eyes for your sitting check. And that eliminates a large portion of minority women, 74% of Black women, 72% of Hispanic women, 61% of Asian women, because not only did we design the aircraft only using a male standard in the 1960s, we used it largely on a white male standard. So different ethnicities have different types of body proportions, even if they are the same type.
That's really phenomenal when you really look at it's a vertical challenge as a part of a larger systematic barrier. I think you've stated it before. And it's reference based on what standard?
The 1967 was an anthropometric survey. So basically it was an aircrew sizing survey when we measured the population. And we attempted as an organization in about 2011 to correct for this, but we ran out of funding. We were able to augment the population with an Army survey to update our males, but we fell short again, having accurate representations of women and minorities again.
Wow. So really the design of the aircraft and flight equipment, you use 95% of the recruiting population of what the standard is now, or are there ways that we could possibly look towards the future? What have you seen?
So we had quick solution in 2002 when we created a database to see if there was any opportunity to allow members to fly individual aircraft that may have not met the 5'4". And this affects men as well. They can be too short or too tall as well. There's a limit of 6'5", but it disproportionately affects them at 3.7%. So we created a waiver process for our officers to apply for. And that data was the solution given for the last 20 years because the aircraft designed before women can fly in combat, it's understandable they wouldn't use female data. So we needed to find a solution for that. But the problem was the data was masking a problem. And the problem is we still weren't designing aircraft to the 95th percentile of the population. When you're briefing senior leaders and you say, I'm approving 100% of these waivers, you're not telling them the rest of the information that they're only going to fly a KC-135 and nothing else. So you don't start examining the aircraft design that you're designing now, such as the F-35. So the F-35 is about 97% friendly for females and men. The goal was 95%, but we didn't get there on their own. Originally, we designed it for 55% of women. And then later on, the Undersecretary of Defense Acquisition mandated it to become 80%. And it wasn't until Congress got involved that we got to the 95% goal that we have today. So what I found was that unless we have big ticket items that garner attention from Congress, that we continue to design equipment and aircraft using the current aircrew population, which is based on the 1960s standard. So we keep self-perpetuating these baked-in barriers, if that makes any sense.
Right. I mean, design, form follows function. Design matters. And design in many different things. It's not just this design. It's the acquisition system. It's using all sorts of different inputs in creating something that's best use for the population that's going to serve. I think you've done a tremendous amount with respect to your writing and your work on the Women's Initiative team, which really did prompt the DoD. What were some of the things that resulted from that?
Well, the first thing we did was we took away the word waiver because we found that women were self-eliminating because when they read, if you Google it and you say, how tall do you have to be a pilot? It says 5'4". And when you're 19 years old, you think that's the standard, so you don't apply. So you self-eliminate. And we replaced it with the language to say that you need additional measurements to be tailored to an aircraft. So that was the first thing we did. The second thing we did is we did not create a waiver process at all for our career enlisted fields. So that's 15,000 aviators that we have that fly in 10 different positions, anywhere from flight attendants to load masters on cargo aircraft, boom operators and air refueling aircraft, flying linguists. We were just implying that our pilot standards would be good enough for the enlisted standards, even though it didn't accurately represent how tall you had to be with no waiver process. So what we created was a system to start measuring aircraft again, like we did in 2002, to include the enlisted this time. So we were only creating solutions for our officers and not our enlisted. And as of 2 weeks ago, the Air Force decided to take some risk and go ahead and lower some standards in aircrew positions that make sense. Why do you have to be 5'4" to be a flight attendant? You don't. So they went ahead and eliminated that standard right now until they get a study to see what the accurate standard would be. And the last thing we did is we approached the Undersecretary Acquisitions for the Air Force, Dr. Will Roper, and presented the data to him about the F-35, how we still get equipment design wrong because we're only using the user population, which we know is 95% men, and not including the entire recruiting population. And he mandated data that all future aircraft design and aircrew flight equipment, which is like your helmets, your G suits, even the flight suits you wear, will now accurately represent the population from which it recruits from.
That is phenomenal. And one of the big changes is the maternity flight suit. Is that correct?
Yes, that was coming from a different initiative when we were talking about pregnancies. And when we talked about aircraft design, we were talking about why do you have 2% female fighter pilots? Well, it might have to have something to do with the F-15 only accommodates 8.9% of women. It's not because we don't want to be fighter pilots, it's because we can't fit in the cockpit. So that was the getting people in the door. One of the major reasons we couldn't keep people to stay was because when they decide to start a family, they start hitting a maternal wall. Women have been
Right.
flying in the Air Force for the last 20 years, mainly in their second trimester and largely in heavy aircraft. Yet we never provided them a uniform, a safety uniform to accommodate their expanding midsection. This is just a basic requirement to fly aircraft. And as a result, they would just get the next couple sizes up as they grew, which would become a problem because the arms and legs would become baggy. And then they would when I flew during my 3 pregnancies, the arms would start catching onto the flight controls and actuating things that shouldn't be actuated. So I'd have to kind of tape down or Velcro down my arms and my legs so I wouldn't trip. Or women will go to a tailor and spend money on their own and using thread that might not be flame resistant or heat resistant to make the flight suit more accommodating for their body as it grows.
Wow. That's what a story. And kudos to your 3 kids who've got flight time. That's pretty cool.
I think they have 350 hours between the 3 of them.
That is awesome. That is really well done. Well done to your family. I think something you've noted in your writing as well is that one of the most important things to say about kind of this gender gap data, it's not generally malicious or even deliberate. Really it's the opposite. It's the product of the way that's been thinking because that's what the standard was for a millennia. And in this new idea, kind of opening the circle to a wider variety, you really address how have you worked to really peel back those layers so that you can identify outdated acquisition models, which really are, as you've stated, the root cause of the problem?
I think it's just simply getting the right data to the senior leaders. It's not difficult to get them to say yes once you get the data to support your position. There's this great book called Invisible Women, Data Bias in a World Designed for Men by Caroline Criado Perez. She did an entire book on legacy barriers, and what she notes is that these barriers are not nefarious of nature. Like you mentioned, men want to eliminate barriers for women, they just don't know how. She gives a great example about cars. She mentions that the crash dummy was invented for safety reasons in 1950s, but it wasn't until 2011 that we actually used a female test dummy. And as a result, even though men are more likely to get in a car accident than women, women are 47% more likely to become seriously injured and 71% more likely to become moderately injured and even 17% more likely to die than a man, simply because we didn't use a test dummy that took their body type into account because we tend to sit closer to the steering wheel. And we don't even have anything for pregnant women. So I would just take a lot of data from a lot of contracts. I recruited a team. I couldn't have done this without many female pilots and male pilots and engineers that volunteered and doctors, and just put these presentations together and went on a roadshow to key stakeholders. So often these policies like aircraft design and the human system integration, it's cross-functional. So you have to be able to synchronize those efforts. So this had the medical community because they held the medical standard for height, the engineering community, the anthropometrics lab with amazing scientists like Jennifer Whitestone, the operators that are in charge of the policy, which is our HAFI 3, and our Air Education and Training Command, because they're the one that is in charge of the accessions, the waivers, the process to onboard these people and take them into undergraduate pilot training.
When I'm listening to what you're saying, it really is also akin to some of the things that we're seeing with technology with respect to algorithms and how they're written and how we use big data and, the flow of artificial intelligence and the point that those people and why we encourage, especially me, I encourage so many women to just explore the STEM field because the more voices there are in the room with respect to how we're setting these things up, that will result in a better overall system with respect to anything in technology, the future of information. Really, when we have representation of all different groups, it does create for a better end result, and it ensures that we're just not pipelining into, the male crash test dummy. I think it's also phenomenal that you've really talked about kind of trailblazing for the next generation of accessions, and how do you see those things that you can do to open the door to make sure that we're remaining globally competitive?
I think it's critical to our national defense strategy that we increase the number of minorities and women and other people and from other underrepresented groups into our military. I see it when I'm trying to do an initiative. I think it's very important to be able to understand the people you're trying to convince, the decision makers, why it's in the best interest of the military. Often when we think of diversity, we think of lowering a standard. So I like to create a business case analysis of why this is their best interest, why they should change policies and fund things, because senior leaders can say that they support something, but until they put the funding behind it for long-term sustainment, they're not really truly fully supporting it. So I see it as a national defense strategy, strengthening it, because China by 2030 is going to have 4 times the population as the United States, and they're going to have 15 times the STEM graduates, as well as twice the GDP. So in layman's terms, they're going to have more people, smarter people, and more money. At the same time, our accessions process, we're having a hard time finding quality recruits. A 2018 study from the Department of Defense released that 71% of America's youth is ineligible to serve. So our population is getting smaller.
Right.
So if we want to compete with China, we need to have access to our full population, not just the ones that we can onboard. So the best case scenario, we're going to have 4 to 1 to China. So why would we start eliminating that ratio right off the bat? We're sandbagging ourselves. So I'm trying to get this mentality of inclusiveness equals competitiveness, period. It's just simple numbers. We need to access them. And we're actually lowering the standard. Here's a great example. The career enlisted aviator. There's a cryptolinguist, which is essentially a person that sits in the back. It's a flying linguist that has to intercept messages real time and take that data and get it to decision makers very quickly. Well, we have a hard time recruiting these people because their academic aptitude tests have to be so high to show that they have the propensity to learn a foreign language, that such as like Chinese Mandarin. So we were unable to achieve this, and we were significantly undermanned. And this is one of the career fields that we were eliminating almost half the female population from because of a sitting height, which has nothing to do with their ability to do their jobs. They simply have to sit in a chair in the back and be able to egress the aircraft. So why is that standard there? So as a result, instead of getting access to half the female population that could have easily filled that without lowering the academic score, they chose to lower the academic test. And as a result, they got more people in the door, especially men, but they were washing out and being retrained at high cost to the Air Force. We could have easily just lowered the standard right there and took risk, or we could have done a study for about $125,000 to determine the minimum sitting and standing height for that individual. The cost of that study would have been $125,000. The cost of just one linguist is $250,000. So basically, we're losing money and we're losing talent. And this is why it's so important that we get this right.
I heard that story and immediately thought, number one, that's crazy. Number two, no business would run like this. I mean, that just a simple business study. If it costs $250,000 to train a linguist, easy. Let's do a study, knock it out of the ballpark at half the price, and be able to bring these people into the door. I've had quite success in my field dealing with linguists, and linguists are incredibly hard to recruit, hard to train, and hard to ensure that they stay at that high level of proficiency, especially in a very tough language like Chinese Mandarin. Kudos to you for really trying to push this initiative forward, because overall, number one, we save money, we increase the number of people that can support this critical mission and also have the skills. I think it's a great effort, and I am glad that we have people like you in our national security arena that are ready to say, hey, this is a dollars and cents, but just common sense part that we can change. Small tweaks, they make a huge difference. And I think you've spoken in the past with respect to representation matters and kind of the images you see yourself in those positions. How have you used that to your favor now that you've increased in rank and you're a leader in the Air Force?
One thing that I changed in my leadership style over the last couple of years was I stopped hiding and started getting out front more. I think in the past, I didn't want to stand out in any way as a woman because I felt that it took away from people questioning if I got selected for a promotion or a position, because I was a diversity hire instead of earning it based on my qualifications and being the best candidate. So I shied away from these things. And instead, I stayed in the background and was slingshotting individuals over barriers and helping them navigate the process by helping them get height waivers or navigate pregnancy. But my husband drew it to my attention that I can do this all day long, and I'll stay up till midnight, 1 a.m, helping people do their paperwork to get through the system. But what if I just started getting out in front and starting being a representation of a woman that can have 3 children and make it to a full career in the Air Force without having to get out? Women in the Air Force for pilots are only retained at about 39% at the end of their service commitment, which is typically between 11 and 13 years, compared to men, which is around 62 to 63%. And it's mainly because a RAND study in 2018 said that 83% of the surveyed said that there was lack of female leaders that had children to visualize success, and that 85% didn't see how they could time a pregnancy. So with that data, I just started writing articles and say, this is my story. This is how I hit the maternal wall. This is the jobs that were turned off to me. This is how I overcame it. You can do it too. And what I'm seeing now is that my generation, and we're in a military that has 5 generations. I think I'm about the 3rd generation in the middle. So I can see both sides. I can see up and down because I'm right there in the middle right now. I'm seeing women behind us starting to be not ask permission to have children, but just, I want to start a family. I'm going to start a family. And they're doing it younger, and they're less unapologetic about it.
Which is a sea change for the better. Because as we look at our national security, we want the best and the brightest. And we don't want this pipeline problem, it being a slow drip. Instead, you've got to start with the bigger pipeline and allow that pipeline to continue to flow. And I think what the work that you're doing is great. You've talked to ensuring that policies and procedures, you've also said they shouldn't require congressional assistance. Earlier in the episode, you kind of mentioned how Congress had to get involved. I mean, to ensure equitable representation, it should be on our leaders right now to kind of grab hold and say, hey, we can make changes to these documents, work with the medical field to make sure things are better for that next generation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do believe that senior leaders absolutely want to increase their numbers and they want to remove barriers. They just don't know how. I think there's a disconnect when it starts getting to the highest level of the Air Force because the way the data is presented doesn't allow them to see the root cause of the solution. Like the example I gave about all the waivers are being approved, so what's the issue? They don't get the full story. And other pieces of information that would show why a barrier is there. I like to give the example of the Department of Defense. The total numbers of women that are active duty are 16%. Across the board. For the Air Force, it's slightly higher. It's at 21%. For the Army, it's about 17%. But you got to look at what is the representation of minorities and women when you start to get to middle management and senior management. Does it accurately represent the 21%, or is it starting to go downwards? And then you need to identify why. Instead of just saying, hey, I have 1 out of 5 women in the Air Force, 1 out of 5 people in the Air Force are women. You need to keep peeling those layers back. You should ask at least 5 whys. Why, and continue to drill until you get to the core of the issue.
I like it. Just almost like a 2 and 3 year old. I mean, they know how to do this, right? It's like an onion. You've spoken about it in the past, having those layers. If you continue to dig down, and I think oftentimes leaders just ask the why 1 or 2 times and they get a very surface level answer. But those who really dig and are curious, that insatiable appetite for the real meaning and the real truth underneath, you can get to beyond complacency. And I think you've stated complacency is the enemy of innovation. With the innovation, we really can kind of change this system rather than accepting the first why answer to the pipeline problem or bringing more people in and sustaining that same level of rate when you go to middle and higher management. Continuing to ask why, because it will get to the answers that help the entirety of the service and all of the Department of Defense and even greater national security. We can face those emerging challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. And one way senior leaders can do this is having measurable metrics and milestones and following up routinely. So to make sure that they're not getting lip service or getting a really quick solution and not a sustainable solution. I
think you quote your Air Force Chief of Staff, and I thought this was a pretty good quote. We've got to make sure that we build the environment out there where the right thing is easy and the wrong thing is hard.
General Goldfein, that was the chief of staff's quote there before General Brown. He really put his money where his mouth was. Days before he left his position, he has competing priorities and so many things he wants to do. Yet he still took the time to have meetings about female fitment events, whether it was the bladder release system for fighter pilots that is not ideal for women. There's lots of leakage and it causes rashes and infections. The maternity flight suit, and also having the two-piece flight suit for women available because the one we designed was only for men. And he held senior leader meetings with funding and metrics and milestones all the way up until his last days of office. So I'm very grateful that I had the opportunity to witness that and to really see a senior leader take it so far. Like he always says, go long.
I love it. I love it. What else should our audience know about the work that you've done and where you see the Air Force and, in totality, the Department of Defense going?
I am very hopeful. I would like to say, I think when people hear you're a lieutenant colonel or colonel working at the Pentagon, that it has to be at that level, that four-star generals have to make these changes. But you don't have to be. I was just a really frustrated major in the field flying the line when I started this. And when I started seeing things affect women in the field that happened to me but happened to them, I got fired up and I really wanted to make a difference. You can do this. You just need passion and competence. You're going to need the passion because you're going to be frustrated. You're going to be told no a lot when you first attack something. General Brown talks about the 5 no's. He talks about you're going to get this. Whenever you try to make an institutional change, you're going to get hell no, no. We'll look into that. We should look into that. And then why haven't we done it? We should have done this 5 minutes ago. So keep pressing. Don't be discouraged. So you're going to need that passion. And then you need to have the confidence. So you can be very passionate, and you'll need that emotion to keep you energized. But bring the data-driven decisions, and be persistent. I literally was on a Facebook rant one day about a pregnancy barrier for women to attend PME. That's a professional military education course required for promotion. They were getting blocked, and eventually I was able to bring the data. And these teams, like the Women's Initiative team and innovation teams, eventually found me and helped me get the megaphone I needed to deliver the information to the right people.
And that's phenomenal, because the institutional barriers that exist, we can easily, by the stroke of a pen, make a change for the most part. It's a change that leaders will have to accept, but there are always, again, my mantra is there's an exception to every policy out there. And what you've done is when you totally change the policy, we don't have to keep making exceptions. It just becomes the norm. Jess, thank you for all the work that you've done. I have seen from afar and admired this work for a long time. It's great to have you as a guest on my show, and I truly appreciate the work that you've done to continue to ensure that our national security functions at its highest level with those best people in it. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
That was Lieutenant Colonel Jess Ruttenber. If you want to learn more about her great work, please check out her blog, Hidden Barriers. I'll have the link in the show notes. I really appreciate you listening to this conversation. And if you want more candid perspectives on leadership, go to colonelcandid.com. There, you'll find articles, podcasts, and resources for your leadership journey. I would also encourage you to share this podcast with your friends, colleagues, and whoever you think could benefit from the information and wisdom shared by my amazing guests. I know I grow with every conversation, and we want to share that experience with as many leaders as we can. This show grows by word of mouth, so be sure to share this podcast. And if you think we earned it, leave us a 5-star review. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Colonel Candace Frost.